Hi, everyone, and welcome to the OnGo Forward. We had a whole week of exciting topics, and today we'll cover the neutral host, the OnGo neutral host session. So I'll be your host and moderator. A little background about myself. So I work for American Tower. My role there is Global Innovation Strategy in the Office of CTO. For those that don't know much about American Tower, with the leading independent tower company and neutral host provider for in-building as well. And my role in CBRS Alliance, I'm a member of the board of director of the OnGo Alliance, as well as the vice chair of the business working group. And within the business working group, the role that we play is to tap the market and understand the needs and translate that into a requirement that we feed into different working groups, such as the technical working group, as well as the marketing working group and deployment working group. Next slide. So again, welcome, and we have an hour full of great speakers. So with us, we have Chetan Sharma. He's a world-renowned consultant, and he's going to cover the neutral host market insights. And we have from T-Mobile, Luke Lucas, who's a senior manager, and they're going to talk about the carrier perspective in terms from CBRS as a whole and neutral host. And then I'll come back briefly just to give a quick overview of what OnGo neutral hosts mean and definition. Then I'll bring my colleague, Steve Wimsatt, who is also a vice chair of the business working group and a senior director with CommScope, to talk about a survey we conducted in the business working group to share with you some data. Next slide, please. So Chetan Sharma is the CEO of Chetan Sharma Consulting. He brings an extensive experience in the telecom business. He consults and advises executive in the wireless communication in a nation that includes tier one MNO. And he is a renowned author where his books were adopted in major universities, as well as you see many of the articles in the major newspapers such as the Times and Wall Street. And so we're happy to have him here to talk about the market insights of on CBRS and neutral hosts. And he holds advanced degrees from Kansas State University. The floor is all yours, Chetan.
Great. Thank you, Youssef. And thank you, Youssef and Oren, for having me. For today's discussion, I thought it might be useful for us to step back a bit and see the evolution of neutral host and networks in general in the context of history. And then we might get a better sense of what it means in context of the other trends that are going on at the same time. So if you look historically, generally the technology cycles take place in 30, 40-year cycles. And so the long wave economists have studied this for over 100 years. And these cycles have been consistent and have taken place over the last 250 years. The last cycle being the cycle of telecom and internet that has taken its due course for 30, 40 years. And I have humbly proposed that we are in a new cycle called, which I term as connected intelligence. Other people have called it fourth industrial revolution. But the notion is that we are transitioning from the previous cycle that helped us build the infrastructure for digital into a new cycle that is enabled by software, that is enabled by sensors. And so that's kind of the big trend number one. The other big trend that's going on is the flip-flop that happens between centralized and decentralized every 10 years or so. And we are clearly have gone from kind of the cloud-centric nature of computing and communications to a more decentralized or edge-based computation and communications. So we'll see a natural shift over this decade to a more decentralized model. The other significant trend, and that's unique to the last 20 years or so, is the notion what I call synchronous S-curves. We're all familiar with the S-curves. They generally go one after another, building upon what has happened in the previous cycle. But starting maybe from the internet cycle, we saw that internet and computing cycle kind of were going simultaneously. And what happens is when you have two synchronous curves, they feed off each other. And that creates a tremendous intensity in the marketplace, tremendous opportunity in the marketplace. And so from that, we came to the LTE cycle, which started around 2010 or so. And the entire decade, we saw just an enormous upsurge in activity with respect to LTE, cloud, and smartphones. So there were three synchronous curves, and we saw at least 10x jump in activity in terms of number of billion-dollar companies created as a result of that cycle. Now we're entering the third cycle of synchronous curves, and that has access piece. Clearly, 5G is going to power that, but also the notion of open compute, also the notion of edge internet, also the notion of robotics, blockchain, and so on and so forth. So there are many more inputs to the synchronous S-curves thesis that's taking place. The other big trend that has taken place over the last 10 years is the shift of revenue from access to the upper layers of the stack. And that has significant implications on how revenue is generated and the power shifts within the ecosystem stack. As we get into the 5G cycle, it's very clear that it's going to be an enterprise-focused cycle over the long term. Clearly, the early days will be focused on the consumer, but the real bulk of the revenue generation over the next 10 years is likely to be in the enterprise segment. Now, there's a lot of focus in the wireless industry on communications, but equal understanding has to be focused on computing. For I believe that it's the combination of computing and communications that's what's going to create the big transformation that everybody's expecting, the big ROI that everybody's expecting. And individually, they are great and interesting, but it's the power of the two, the edge and open networks, that's what creates the real opportunity for the enterprises and for the players involved. And as such, we clearly understand how the networks have been deployed, especially over the licensed network. Roughly whatever 1,500 operators worldwide. But the future is clearly that of network of networks, meaning we'll have these interconnected networks, private and public, and it's the goal of the ecosystem to really make that happen. And so whether it's the Wi-Fi network or it's the CBRS network or the other private networks across industries, across the segments of consumer and enterprise, and how do we kind of stitch that together both from a communications point of view as well as a computing point of view. That will be the real opportunity in my view. As such, the two things that really matter for any trend to take hold are scale. How fast can you scale into both from the usage point of view, how many consumers, how many end users are actually using something, as well as the ecosystem. How fast can you develop an ecosystem for the trend to take hold? And we see that the notion of private networks, the notion of CBRS type networks is taking hold and is adding to the notion of network of networks. And so how enterprises take a look at it and deploy it in various industry verticals will be fascinating to watch. And we'll get into the discussion, hopefully, during the Q&A. Now, there are clearly a number of neutral host possibilities around how neutral hosts are deployed, whether they are unlicensed or from the spectrum of the operator, or there's some private spectrum available as it is in certain countries, how the sharing will be done, who manages those networks, who deploys those networks, what are the roaming arrangements if the roaming is needed, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the use cases, clearly a number of industries are candidates for a neutral host. The most obvious ones are where the footprint is segregated from kind of the wide area network that consumers play in. And so anything that related to venues, anything related to self-contained environment like mining or maybe even agriculture or manufacturing. And these are all great candidates. Oil and gas is another one. Some of the rural remote areas operation for consumer as well as enterprise are good use cases. And we are seeing activity in each of them. Some of them have been actually happening for more than 5 to 10 years because there was a need and the country might have granted some private spectrum to the various industries as well as the companies. So clearly there are a number of opportunities that I kind of mentioned and alluded to, but there are also issues around how is this actually going to happen. By its very nature, network of networks means the market is going to be fragmented, but alliances like OnGo will help stitch together or make sense of making it easier for enterprises to adopt solutions, just like what happened with the Wi-Fi over the last 20 years. And so I think the expertise of planning and managing networks is going to be a critical one, whether it's system integrators, new players emerge, or it's the MNOs and cable companies that come in, or completely new types of solutions that are just plug and play is what's going to be needed before enterprises really embrace enhancing their networks to include 3GPP type technologies. For the operators, CBRS is clearly an opportunity. I remember back when Wi-Fi was coming in 2008 to 2010 timeframe, a lot of operators viewed Wi-Fi as an enemy. In fact, they took out ads to say so. And so over the time, it clearly has proven that Wi-Fi is a great complement to licensed networks. And I think same case is with the variety of unlicensed spectrum that's becoming available. The key for the operator is how do they mix and match the various assets using the tools that they have to make it a great experience for the consumer, as well as especially the enterprises where the new market is really taking shape, where the bulk of the demand is going to rise. And so the amount of data consumption in the enterprise will be significantly higher than what's consumed by the consumer in the 5G cycle. In addition to the existing players, clearly there's a move by the internet players who also see this opportunity from a computing point of view, and so they want to take the cloud into the network or bring communications onto the computing platform. Just like operators see computing as part of the communication platform, they see the reverse. And so we are likely to see a strong play from the cloud players into this segment, and that's what's going to make this ecosystem very dynamic and interesting, because you will see a new flavor of competition coming into how networks are deployed, and who participates, and how the revenue streams split up between various entities, and who takes the ownership, and so on and so forth. So there is a significant potential for new products that help enable this future. You don't want the intelligence needs to be in the software to figure out what's best for the consumer or the end customer at that given moment, and figure it out for the consumer or the end user, or for that matter, end user being a machine in manufacturing with robots and whatnot, which is already being used. And so new players clearly will come into play who are either focused on certain niche areas like industry verticals that they build expertise in, or the horizontal layer making things easier for enterprises and MNOs to deploy networks using a neutral host. So those are kind of my thoughts around how the neutral host opportunity is emerging and will be a critical layer in how we go forward remainder of the decade.
Great. Thank you, Chetan. We have a couple of questions here that I'd like to go over. One of the question is based on the pandemic. Where do you see as one of the first vertical in enterprise that will adopt neutral host, in your opinion? So
there are, it's a larger discussion around, what stays after the pandemic is over. Clearly there was a big need for schools and students to connect, and we, at least in the US, we were not able to provide that connectivity despite our best efforts. There's still a lot of pockets where we don't have that connectivity available. And so schools and education is a critical element that will continue to benefit even post-pandemic, just to make sure that we provide, if we are going to talk about the future where we have VR and AR type of application which require tremendous bandwidth, we really need to up the game in the capacity delivered to the consumer, in this case, the student and the school. And so I think education will clearly be at the forefront of what's needed. But I think the bigger opportunity is clearly around very self-contained environments where it's easier to deploy networks, and the enterprise has much more control over how it's deployed, have the control over the latencies and the KPIs. And so places like mining or environments like hospitals, where you will start to see a lot of transmission of data back and forth, and they're looking to up the game in terms of capacity. You're seeing newer areas that were not there before, like agriculture, which can be, again, self-contained. It doesn't need that much interop with the public networks. And so those are some of the areas that are popping up for industry segments.
Great, thank you. Another question: what do you see as the key value proposition for wireless operators to adopt neutral host?
I mean, clearly, some of the enterprises are looking at neutral host to see if they can transfer their data traffic onto something other than the operator network. And so generally, the monetization of wireless data has been that it equates from gigabytes to dollars. And so if the data is being transmitted, is shifted, unloaded from the operator network to other types of network, they are likely to lose the revenue. That's the first knee-jerk reaction. But I would say, it's going to happen regardless. It's going to happen whether operators like it or not. So it's in the interest of the operators to get involved in making the neutral host market happen. And the reason is it helps them provide new types of services that they were not offering to the enterprises before. I mean, generally, the operators have been very focused on the consumer market, not the enterprise. And so the managed services space is open for them to take and play a critical role. The other aspect is, in some instances where the unlicensed spectrum is not enough, you will have the opportunity to combine that with the licensed spectrum to make it a complete solution depending on the use case. And so if the operator is not in the game, they will not see that opportunity that easily. And so it's in the interest of the operators to get actively involved, because the other threat is that the internet players might get there first, and they might lose on the opportunity.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and that could be a segue to the next speaker. So this question talks relative to network slicing and where 5G is providing, and how we can leverage that to empower the carrier to get into RAN sharing and shared economics. Can you say a word or two about that?
Yeah. So I mean, the kind of the new and unique feature of 5G is slicing, and essentially enterprise or a use case or a moment can have its own slice of the network. Essentially, you get a piece of the network. Now, this slice can be combined with all sorts of other tools available in the marketplace, and so the slice can be combined with traffic that's surging at a venue or at a logistics facility, or it could be at the hospital, or it can be a dedicated slice that's given to that entity in concert with anything else they might be doing with the unlicensed spectrum. So I think it's a combination and permutation that makes evolution of slice with everything else very interesting, and especially around the business model. How would you convey the value of that slice or the piece of the network in a given location based on the use case and the SLAs? And so I see that as a fairly interesting and a new proposition that's coming into the marketplace that people are starting to tinker with.
Thank you, Chetan. With that, we close with Chetan. And so we'll go to our next speaker. Next slide. So we have with us from the wireless service provider T-Mobile, Luke Lucas, who is a senior manager, and he brings a really extensive experience in the wireless telecommunication. And his focus is really on bringing the signal from the public network to in-building. So he spent many, many years focusing on the enterprise and the smart city application and smart building. So we're happy to have Luke with us to give us the perspective from the wireless carrier provider. And he has a degree from University of Southern California. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Luke. Sorry.
Youssef, good morning. And thank you for having me and hosting me today. What I'd like to share with the audience today is a little bit about what we believe is another dynamic tool in the toolbox As many, if not all of you know, originally VoiceStream, our original brand of T-Mobile, initiated what was hotspot calling years ago in 2007, then subsequently then known as Wi-Fi calling. As we know, 14 years later, that continues to be an active tool in the toolbox. So as we expand the toolbox and that discussion today, I want to take you through a series of slides that kind of gives you our perspective of the level of engagement that we have with the marketplace, and that we truly believe that it's a unique opportunity to expand and widen the technology roadway to be capable enough to really apply to any custom situation. So Josh, can we move to the next slide? So T-Mobile started to look at in-building coverage about 6 years ago, and luckily I was in a position moving from Major League Baseball, from my assignment on the 29 stadiums in the US, to a next opportunity. So when I created a business plan that said, what are we going to do for the in-building connectivity, bringing the outdoor signal indoors, I created what is known today as Build Your Own Coverage, also known as BYOC. Build Your Own Coverage is exactly that. We know statistically that at least 80%, now this is CommScope stats from 5 years ago, so you can only imagine that 80% probably really means 100% of call traffic is started and stopped today, especially during the pandemic, especially during civil rights and all the other activities that are going on, including generally that we're all working from home for the most regard. So with that, how do you then look at increased speeds for network capability and access? How do you look at the public safety? Certainly that's our key concern. Everybody needs 911 access. I truly believe, and we're working with MIT currently on a white paper that is going to produce an alignment that shows that property values are very relative to connectivity. So if your real estate doesn't have water, sewer, gas, electricity, and now wireless connectivity, guess what? You most likely in your appraisal, most likely in your sale transaction, most likely in just your tenant relations, you will suffer. So is it monetization of network infrastructure? And is that a connection to the carrier as we move into 5G? We don't think so, because the second line item on our balance sheet is the cost of the network. So we do believe this is a shared responsibility, a utility-like environment, and a responsibility for the property operator. And we use that term for everybody who touches real estate to really look effectively at what are the solutions. Josh, let's go on to the next slide. So where do we see, and this is the term that we use internally. So certainly CBRS has advanced now to OnGo, and internally we just describe it as private networking or private networks. So as Chetan previously indicated, there are a number of fields that either have been for some time or now are considering technology and the advancement of that technology. And why is that? Well, we know basically because truly business now is more complex than ever. And to solve that, literally, it does take technology now as the enabler. So we see an expansion of industries that are engaging with us, and then certainly some of the staple industries that we've known for a long time. Certainly medical now is at the forefront of many of our minds, universities and getting students back into the classroom, and whether homework or schoolwork is produced at home or at school or both, that's the enabler. And then getting, lastly, people back to the office in any regard based on your corporate culture and the corporate mission. So we do see this dynamically expanding. Josh, let's move to the next slide. So, as I've described, business climate is sophisticated, is complex, and with that becomes many times a discussion in business enterprise and government as to some needs that are then business-centric, and how do you then address those needs? And here is just simply 6 illustrations of some of the discussions that most, if not all, enterprise and government operations are having on a consistent basis. Probably one that I probably missed this week is the most dynamic, and sorry I missed it, security. So let's call it these 7 dynamic ones that are constantly in flux, constantly in play. And with that discussion, it then creates connectivity options, connectivity choices, and the dynamic nature around that. Josh, let's go to the next slide. So let's have a little bit of a discussion of private networks. And when you see that aligned with at least the T-Mobile core, this discussion is really not to be T-Mobile centric today. This is all carrier centric, because if you are owning and operating a business, you need to be appealing to every single person that comes through your doors. And you don't know who that's going to be. You don't know if that's a vendor, if that's an employee, if that's an investor, if that's public safety. So you really have to solve for every equation humanly possible, and obviously reduce risk management at the same time, and of course, business capability. So we don't know what to prescribe until we actually have that discussion with the client. And it really is going to come from a series of integration partners, OEM partners, and consulting partners that really are our partner in bringing us to the table as they prescribe for the solution. So this just touches on, does it become a private network opportunity? Yes or no? Is this an edge computing network, as Chetan mentioned earlier? Yes or no? Is this a carrier component? Or is it all of the above? Or is it just a hybrid, as we talked? Wi-Fi still will be in play, and that will be Wi-Fi 6 for most people that will upgrade. PassPoint will be an opportunity. Those obviously aren't 5G solutions, but they are solutions. So what is the solution? And that is what we're having a conversation with today. Josh, let's move on to the next slide. So as we've discussed, what is the prescription? What is best to suit your needs as an enterprise or a government? Is that a combined component, or is it a singular component that you focus on because of maybe logistics, maybe operations, maybe security, maybe sensors, maybe compliance? What is it that ties you to the technology that solves your equation and at the same time builds a wireless roadmap? Everybody today, and I certainly continue to evangelize the messaging that you might have a security plan on your real estate. You might have a fire safety plan. You might have an earthquake plan, but you have to have a technology plan. And that roadmap is going to be as fluid as the day, and it's going to be constantly changing. So what might be good today might have a change for you tomorrow, but you've got to be looking at it, and you've got to constantly be reviewing it. And of course, today we're just touching on at least 3 of the topics that will engage that conversation. Josh, let's go on to the next slide. So certainly all the carriers can support this, but T-Mobile has built new teams now that focus on how do we support the engagement with private networks, and is that the right prescription for you? So what is your pain points? What are your goals and objectives? What is it that you're looking to achieve or solve for? And then that really then equates to, what are the benefits that are sought? What, if at all, is it solving on your pain points, and certainly the future pain points that you might not even know today? What is this in position of spectrum licensing? We at T-Mobile have seen a number of business enterprises that were successful in securing a PAL license. So are they blending a GAA under OnGo, under private networking with a PAL license? Are they exclusively working on a PAL license? And do they have a commercial cellular grade also involved? And last but not least, when you're operating or thinking of operating a private network, it is a challenge. It is a chore. It is monitoring and maintenance, modernization and upgrade over time. So you've got to mentally and physically and staffing wise be prepared. So it is a challenge. But if it's the right prescription for your business or your government operations, it may be exactly that hand in glove fit. Josh, let's move to the next slide. Last but not least, thank you for joining me today. If, when and where I can help you in any way, please reach out to me. I'm available as a gold member on LinkedIn. Certainly, my name hopefully should be synonymous with Luke like Skywalker and Lucas like George Lucas. Pretty easy to remember. And yes, since I have just graduated from my 20th anniversary with T-Mobile, I don't have a number in my email address, so it's simply luke.lucas@t-mobile.com. Last but not least, we have a collateralized website that is really a coaching engagement. I have built over the last 6 years a number of pieces of collateral that really talk about bringing the outdoor signal indoors. So as we continue to touch upwards of 1,500 sites per month, bringing the 600 band, low band, and the 2.5 gigahertz mid-band spectrum to all of our macro outdoor sites, take a look at tmobilebyc.com, because that is really helping you, assisting you, and coaching you on bringing that outdoor signal indoors. Josh, with that, I conclude, and we can go back to Youssef.
Thank you, Luke. And I wish I thought about that and talk about Luke Lucas and the association. Thank you. And happy anniversary, happy 28th with T-Mobile. And thank you for spending it here with us. We appreciate your time. So if you don't mind, we have a few good questions here I'd like to go over with you and get your insight here. So one of the questions is, what is T-Mobile doing to enable devices to support not only private network, but also that seamless mobility across public and private networks?
Well, I think first and foremost, we've been very persuasive, as well as other carriers, in making sure that band 48 is in the handsets. Certainly now with the concluded C-band auction, and boy, the numbers were just astounding this week. Carriers, in addition to ourselves, had made a major investment in that. So what do we need to do now? We need to get to the original equipment manufacturers. We need to make sure that their R&D is in place. We really had a challenge, Youssef, as you know, when we first introduced acquiring the 600 band, our N71. Many of the OEMs said, Luke, T-Mobile, we don't have that in our playbook. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. We may over time get to it, and certainly even Apple came late to the party. But our thought is really to make sure that all the OEMs are focused on widening that road of technology, as I first discussed, and that engagement then brings all these options to the table, because we don't know, you don't know, and of course enterprise and government doesn't know what the solution will be until it's actually prescribed and deployed.
Thank you. Another question, actually, I'll try to, the two questions kind of similar. I'll try to frame them to cover both. So the question here is regarding if somebody have deployed already private network, how would T-Mobile enable neutral host or roaming, however you want to call it? I know there's a different solution. Can you say a word about that, please?
So we've been building a couple of internal business plans. Our national RF architecture team and our national revenue team have been building those. From how I track that, Youssef, I really kind of see that it's probably a MOCN opportunity, not a roaming opportunity. Roaming makes my domestic roaming team crazy. Luke, please don't call us to do 1 trillion roaming agreements with people across the United States, because it's a large place. We all know that. And so I do think there's going to be some other avenues to that. We've been working diligently with a number of partners to partner in that space, because we truly believe that it's the strategic partner opportunity to actually then create that solution in addition to T-Mobile. So it's all underway. We're all happy to have discussions with it. And again, it's customized, so it's by prescription, and we want to be involved at the roundtable with that discussion.
Fantastic. In fact, with that, you had answered the next question where you were specific about MOCN. You were asking, where do you enable MOCN? And you seem to, using your power of Lucas and Stop War, you're able to—
May the force be with you. We'll extend that force out to everybody on the call today.
Yes, great. Well, thank you for your time again, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you. Josh, next slide. So I'm back. Briefly, I'll just go quickly on OnGo neutral host network overview and what is the definition. Next slide, please. Again, the way we define OnGo neutral host is a shared network using the CBRS band that extend the coverage and capacity for one or multiple coordinated service providers. And a A service provider definition is, they are the MNOs and the tier 1 carriers. Of course, there are others such as MVNO, MSO, ISP, and in rural area, they are the WISP. And I'd like to point you to the technical specification document on the website. There are a lot more technical detail and different architecture, including the MOCN architecture and what have you. Here, I'm just going to talk about more at a high level and the business side of things. Next slide, please. And here's an illustration of what we mean by neutral host. So let's say, for example, one of the entity is a neutral host service provider. They have a relationship with the enterprise in this dash square where they deploy perhaps a private network, or they just want to deploy neutral host directly. They have established relationship between MNO1. What they're going to do is enable basically the user of the MNO public network to use that OnGo network within the building. So through this relationship, the user of MNO1 or the customer MNO would be seamlessly, as they come in from outside in, they would not recognize which network they're on. They'll be using that network that's been deployed within the enterprise, the OnGo network. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, for the MSO case, in this case, you'll be having the similar experience. It's all about that seamless experience, as Luke earlier hinted to, that the neutral host will enable this user, which is an alternative to the current solution now and more economical and is easy to deploy. On the other hand, folks that don't have this business relationship with the neutral host provider, they will not be able to have that seamless connectivity. And we are working in an alliance with the working group, with the deployment working group, into developing a deployment guide that explains for the folks that want to deploy the neutral host step by step. And that should be available within a month or two. So please check the website for that availability. Next slide, please. So to create a common language, we created this framework for people that have no knowledge, for example, and you wanted to get started. So how do I get started? So as I talked about in the earlier illustration, there are 3 entities involved. You have basically the enterprise segment. You have the neutral host service provider, and they are the 3 POs. They are different managed service providers and what have you. And then we have, of course, the coordinated service provider, which is basically the carriers. And any one of these entities can either deploy the network or they can work all together in harmony. Depends on, like as I said earlier, on the relationship, and depends on how much folks want to get involved to stand a neutral host network. And it starts by understanding the use case, like I mentioned earlier. Is it because a lot of folks in the building are bringing BYOD, and as Luke hinted earlier, about 80% of traffic is in buildings, so you're going to have various people that have different carriers on their phones. So you want to establish that, provide that seamless connectivity, and of course decide if you're going to do GAA or PAL or what have you. And ultimately, you want to make sure you capture the KPI from the carrier to make sure that you're deploying a carrier class network. And as you walk through the elements, you see you're going to hopefully capture the right value proposition and the right innovative business model that gives the flexibility and attract people to use that network. And we have developed a rich ecosystem that you can find on the website that include all the smartphones today that carry the spectrum band, which is called band 48, as well as other devices that are readily available, not only to start your private network, to make it really easy to transition to your OnGo neutral host. And here's an example that I show how we leverage this framework to establish our work stream. Next slide, please. So for example, if you are focusing on hospitality and you want to develop, nothing about OnGo, you want to develop a business case, and let's say you focus on, as I said, in hospitality, and you want to do a use case of mobility. And by the way, we have a lot of collateral that we develop, many use cases that you can leverage to build your business case. And in this case, if you're an enterprise yourself and I want to reach out to a neutral host network provider where you basically have a turnkey solution, they typically have a lot of relationship with the MNO that they get an already, business relationship already established, that they can make this process even much easier. And ultimately, you want to figure out if you're in indoor and outdoor, and you want to use the GAA or PAL. But most likely, if you're indoor, you will most likely use GAA. And of course, having the right KPI and SLA will guarantee you capturing that value that ultimately tied in with the right business model will, and as Luke said, leveraging 3GPP, for example, architecture that they prefer, for example, is Mocha. Then you have the end-to-end solution, and ultimately the value proposition that we want to capture and provide is that enhanced seamless customer experience. And you could see here, beside the obvious, we're providing high capacity, increased coverage, and stronger reliability and better security. It is that seamless mobility that everybody's after that neutral host will enable. Again, we have a lot of collateral on the website. Please check out the details there. The next slide. So I have maybe a time for one question, because I like to give it to my colleague Steve to cover the survey, and I'll come back again and tag with him to take on more questions. Okay, I don't see any questions. So with that, I'll pass it along to Steve. So Steve is my colleague in the Alliance. He's also a vice chair of the Business Working Group. He's been working with me into driving the adoption of OnGo private network as well as neutral host. And he brings a wealth of experience in the telecom, both LTE and Wi-Fi and IoT, focusing from in-building all the way to smart city applications. Thank you, Steve, for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thanks, Youssef. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to talk about a survey that we recently conducted under the auspices of the OnGo Alliance to really actually reach out beyond the OnGo Alliance itself and talk to commercial property owners, both the sort of the commercial real estate people, as well as people in the end industries like hospitality, healthcare, large venues, and try to get a sense of their thinking around the demand for CBRS as a neutral host networking solution. And ultimately, we wanted to learn where things stood, but really we're trying to lay the groundwork, trying to start to build the business case to show, yeah, there really is a ton of pent-up demand for this to try to encourage mobile operator participation. And again, just to be clear, and there's been some back and forth today, but at the beginning of the survey, we highlighted that there's two, at a very simple level, there's two models of CBRS use cases. There's the private LTE, and then there's neutral host. And by neutral host, we really meant the extending the coverage area of participating service providers, and that's what we focused our survey on. I will say I want to give credit to my co-conspirators on the survey, Russell Vest from Ballast Networks, Jerry Warsaw from SureSight, Greg Frasca from ClearLink Communications, and Walter Cannon from Zenfi. They were instrumental in pulling it together and encouraging participation. Okay, so let's get into it. Josh, next page. Okay, so, and I'm going to try to tell a story here. This is not the complete results, but I think you're going to see what you get the key messages. Started out, trying to position who we're talking to, and how is your current indoor wireless coverage? And it's sort of interesting, I guess. It came out with almost a perfect bell curve there, normal distribution. So I guess that's representative. But if you look on the right, we asked, have you actually deployed a DAS, a distributed antenna system? And about 40% had. So right away, that's a pretty good sign that we had a relatively, we had the right target audience, people who understood what we're talking about. I think there's a click here, Josh, a build. Yeah, and actually going to the perception of your current coverage, there are a number of those of the participants who we knew particularly well, and you can just see for the building, the larger building owner operators, they actually had a somewhat worse perception of their indoor coverage, so they might be more interested in improving that with a more neutral host capability. Okay, please advance. So now we go on to, and this is the 40% that had deployed a DAS, they skipped on, but the people who hadn't deployed a DAS, we said, hey, have you considered deploying a DAS? And you can see here on the left, about 40% of them had considered it. So again, we have the right group of people responding to this. So we think we're on the right track here. And the basic findings here of the people who had considered deploying a DAS but hadn't, why not? And you can see, again, it shouldn't be a surprise. The three major issues are price, complexity, and mobile operator engagement or participation. But those were very clearly supported by our findings. So again, this is all, we think, consistent and what we would, validates, that we had the right group. I don't think I don't think we can say it's statistically significant that the largest factor was mobile operator engagement, but it's a major factor here. Josh, next page. So here's where we really started to see some interesting news. First of all, again, going to our group, they were very familiar with CBRS, and they were relatively, very familiar with CBRS as a neutral host solution. So the concept, at least in the group that we surveyed, concept made sense. And then that third section on the left, that could CBRS neutral host address an important business challenge? The largest bar there is there's people are sort of neutral, but that includes people who have already put in a DAS or have good wireless coverage. Honestly, about 45% of the respondents either agree or strongly agree that CBRS neutral host could solve an important business problem. So again, for something that's an entirely new concept, we think that's a very strong metric, strong result. And then even more, if you look on the right side, so again, there aren't CBRS neutral host networks out there, but 45% of our respondents said they had thought about using CBRS as a neutral host solution. So again, for a new technology, we think people were actually surprisingly open and interested in using CBRS as a neutral host platform. So it's about as strong an indication as we could have that there's people looking for help to solve their indoor wireless coverage issues, and they think CBRS could be a great way to do it. And we have other questions in there, but again, it helps solve those key issues of cost, complexity, and engagement. Again, assuming we can solve that third one. So next slide, Josh. And even more surprising is 30% of the respondents said they had actually spoken to mobile operators about, hey, can we use CBRS as an indoor neutral host network option? Again, so the enterprises in our survey, we bought a list, had about 1,000 names, but the enterprises in our survey were not only interested in using CBRS, they were asking about it. So we again took this as a very positive sign that mobile operators are hearing the interest, hearing the demand for this capability. So very promising. We asked, what were you interested in? And honestly, in some face-to-face interviews that the team had done, in preparation for this survey, we really felt that the strongest request was for voice services. But in the survey, we came up with data as the number one, followed closely by voice and IoT. So there's really, people are interested in neutral hosts for, the full spectrum of use cases over wireless. Next slide, Josh. And then finally, we tried to pin down, do you have a preferred business model? And it's a pretty important issue, obviously. And honestly, these findings, I think they highlight that it's either people are unclear or it's too early in the cycle. Starting from the left, what's your preferred neutral host business model? You can own and operate it internally, own it but pay someone to operate it, or just have a managed service provider, someone like American Tower or someone along those lines, come in and own and operate the network and just on a monthly fee. Again, it's the number one response was no preferred business model, and then the entirely outsource it to a managed service provider is number two. And again, a little more detail in our surveys, in our interviews before we got into the surveys, we had a number of people come back and say, these business models, they change, over time based on what the mobile operators are offering, what's the business model du jour, and a number of people just said, I don't care what the business model is, I just want it, and I'll go with whatever is being offered at the time. But again, there doesn't seem to be a really strong, single preference there. And then in terms of your expense model, do you want it to all be CapEx, one-time payment? You just want to pay for it on a monthly basis, some mix. The hybrid, it came out as number one, or number two is people don't know. So less prescriptive there, less definite. Interesting, on the third one, we said, hey, do you need to monetize a potential investment in a neutral host network? So from the enterprise perspective, from the people we're talking about, this means if you're putting in a neutral host network in your property, and you're doing it for the reasons that that Luke talked about, and I think Chetan mentioned it too, you're doing it to improve the value of your business. Is that enough, or do you also want to make some direct revenue back on this neutral host capability? And a large number of people agreed, or strongly agreed, that yes, they do want to actually make some money back on that. So that implies that they would expect to have some form of revenue model from the mobile operators who are participating as a neutral host on their neutral host network. Again, 35% of the people, roughly 35%, didn't agree or disagree. It's like, yeah, they can get some money from it. Obviously, that's good. But, and those people seem to be saying, for me, the value to my business alone would also be adequate. It'd be enough for me to go ahead and move forward. So that highlights a question that does need to be resolved with the mobile operators. What is the business model between the participating service providers and the neutral host network operator? But we think that's something that can definitely be resolved. We think the economics are very favorable. I believe that is my last slide, Josh. So I think we can, one more. And this is just taking again, the pulse of the audience. When do they think that CBRS and neutral host networks will be broadly deployed? A number of them were, I think I'm optimistic, thinking we can do it this year. That's great. I think there are some that are in process, sort of on a one-off basis. But in terms of broad deployment, most of the people felt that by 2022, that's something that ought to be possible. So we're very optimistic. And that's my full presentation. Youssef, were there any questions?
Yes, I have a few questions. Thank you, Steve, for sharing that survey. One question, I'm not sure if you pulled that in survey, but I'm able to add some color, is of the DAS subsystems deployed today, what percentage was operated funded? This is enterprise funded.
We just asked them if they had deployed a DAS or not. We didn't ask the business model on the DAS. That's more of the backwards looking thing. I don't know, Youssef, you might have some insight into that.
Right, I'll shed some light here. As you know, we don't have a quantified data. There may be some data you find in an analyst report, but typically the tier one, what we call tier one venues, these are the large stadiums and what have you, with a lot of foot traffic. Those are operator funded. The mid-tier to the lower tier, which we talk about below 500,000 square feet and below, those you're going to find different combination, most likely self-funded. And this is also an opportunity where we believe CBRS opens up, the doors, because two things: even if you self-funded, you have to wait for a long time to get the signal coming in. That's why the neutral host, to the relationship and agreement they have with multi-carrier, they can accelerate a little bit of that. But in general, it takes about 12 to 18 months to deploy a licensed solution. On the other hand, with CBRS, you can deploy it within weeks, and you can start with private network. And it is, you heard Luke earlier, they're working on a Moken architecture, which enable CBRS neutral host with multi-carrier. And that's another way also that sometimes is neglected. To Steve's point about the generating revenue, the time to market is critical. I mean, if you don't have cellular connectivity and you have to wait 12 to 18 months, that's loss of revenue. And if you have that cellular connectivity to the OnGo neutral host that you deploy within weeks, now you can start generating revenue.
Exactly.
Let's see. There's another question. So with DAS, how do we overcome the dilemma of CBSD requirements of exact lat and long? Yeah, these are being worked at today. I mean, for people that want to do DAS with CBRS band, the Wind Forum, I believe, is working on that. So check again, please, on the website of the Alliance as we update our document. We'll have more to say about that.
Yeah, I think the approach, though, is you would use a CBRS signal source on the DAS, and then you need to treat each of the radio heads as a CBSD. At least that's what I've been told internally.
Great.
Okay.
Any other
questions?
No, no, that's it. This is great. Again, we'll give you some time back, but before we go, thank you again for attending the session. And it's going to be recorded, and the collateral will be on site. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the business working group, played a role of the voice of the customer. We have worked a lot on these use cases. You'll find a lot of these collateral online. Please check the ongoalliance.org. And if you have any additional question, reach out to admin@ongoalliance.org for any question that we'd be happy to answer you offline as well. So with that, we'll close this session, and thank you again for attending today's talk.